In this lesson, we're going to discuss brainstorming the issue essay. To begin, we are going to make a pro, con, or for, against list, and this list will lay the groundwork for coming up with appropriate examples. Here's our prompt again, which you likely recall from our last lesson. The role of government is to ensure the safety of the citizens it governs. The easiest way to organize your ideas is with two columns, one for pro and one for con. Jot down whatever comes to mind under either the corresponding pro or con category. Typically, when you have three statements under each column, you should stop because that is more than enough to build support from. Do not worry if you cannot come up with three positions for each. You might only have two for pro and one for con, and that's okay. That's still enough to build an essay. However, it is important that you come up with at least one counterpoint. Also, do not worry about order. That is to say, do not feel that you have to come up with three statements for pro and then move on to come up with three statements for against or vice versa. Let your brainstorm bounce back and forth. That's perfectly fine. One final point, do not choose a side before you complete your brainstorm. You might feel one way about a topic. In fact, you might feel strongly one way about a topic, but your brainstorm might reveal that you actually came up with better examples to argue the opposing side. It doesn't really matter what your personal beliefs are on a topic, and that's not to say that your thoughts and opinions don't matter in the real world, because they absolutely do. But for the GRE, you want to think strategically. Your mission is to write a persuasive essay, and you want to make that mission as easy as possible. It is easier to write an essay with your strongest examples. So if those strongest examples are from a side that you don't really agree with, that's still the easier essay to write. At this point, if you'd like, go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to brainstorm a few possible pro and con positions for the prompt. Then we'll come back and work through this together. All right, let's work through the process of brainstorming. The first statement we have is in support of the prompt. It is that people can't go about their lives if they're in danger, and that claim suggests that the government needs to keep people safe so that they can lead normal, peaceful lives. Our next one is also in the pro categories. Individuals can't protect themselves from foreign militaries. Makes sense. Individuals really don't have enough power to do that. Our next one shows up in the con category, and that's completely normal. Again, brainstorming usually doesn't happen just with one side and then the other, so it's pretty normal to bounce back and forth. This claim, people are responsible for themselves, suggests that an individual's role in safety is actually greater than the government's. Now moving back to pro side, health crises like combating disease require large-scale management. Some events are just too big for individuals, therefore the government has to step in. We have a couple more con to get to. It's too expensive for the government to do this, and government should serve a different role, and that's taking the stance that the government should prioritize other things like maybe the economy. Okay. Once we have a few arguments and claims, we need to come up with examples that support those arguments and claims. And that leads to this question. Where should my examples come from? Now, you may be tempted to use the pro-con list we made to try to think of examples, but that's not the best way to go. The pro-con list is meant to inspire examples, not be a perfect match to a specific event. Coming up with examples can feel really challenging sometimes, and many test takers feel that this is one of the most stressful parts of the essay process. So here's how to cut down on some of the stress. We actually want to come up with a handful of examples before we ever sit down to write the essay. That way we already have prepared examples to draw from, and we will be able to plug them directly in as evidence to support our claims. You might be wondering how examples made in advance will actually work on test day. And they work because, as we discussed in the last lesson, the topics are incredibly broad, and you control the scope. That means it's very likely that you can narrow the scope of a topic so that your example works. Let's say you had a prompt about business leadership. If that's the case, people like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and Bill Gates would work really well. So if you had a few pre-made examples that remind you of their leadership style or their achievements or their contributions to technology and society, you'd be in great shape to come up with a specific example. There really isn't a set of perfect examples for you to come up with, but let's talk about what can help. Ultimately, examples can come from an incredible variety of sources. Of course, history, literature, and current events are all pretty common categories, and you do want to have a fairly diverse pool of examples to draw from. So oftentimes it's go with what you know. If you know a lot about the United States, if that happens to be in terms of politics, history, or government, then maybe think of a few notable presidents. Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt are great examples, and they're also connected to a number of events that might work really well for your argument. Of course, it helps to go with what you know, so think of historical figures in your home country or country of residence. What are some historical figures or historical or current events that can be prepared into an example? Here's a situation that does pop up. What happens if you get a topic that you don't have a prepared example for? Maybe you don't have a prepared example for leadership, which would be a mistake since that is a common topic, but the situation again does happen. Never fear. You can make up a hypothetical example about a fictitious office manager or a fake Stanford research study. Remember, the essay is not fact-checked. So, let's say a student was really struggling to come up with an example that supports the link between safety and economic productivity. So that student imagined this study. A Harvard study shows countries with governments that promote the safety of citizens are 20 times more economically productive than countries with governments that do not. Is this true? Nobody knows, and more importantly, nobody's going to check. Now let's consider some examples that might work to support the positions we came up for our prompt. As mentioned, ideally, you have an example bank that you're able to draw from for this step in the process. Remember, our pro-con list is for inspiration, not to link directly to examples. So, a good example for this one might be FDR's New Deal. And that's especially if we want to put an economic spin on safety, because FDR's New Deal provided jobs and stability to millions of Americans, helping end the Great Depression. Another example that works well if we focus on the government's role in keeping citizens safe from the threat of war is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Individual citizens certainly aren't usually able to protect themselves when it comes to international conflicts. Another possibility is an example that explores what happens when a government fails to ensure the safety of its citizens, and the French or American revolutions would work well as supporting evidence here. At this point, we have a solid list of examples that agree that a government should ensure the safety of its people. So the brainstorm is revealing that we should probably write our essay from the pro perspective or the pro side. However, we do still need a counterexample, and this is where the slippery terms might help us. We can build a counterexample around the way a government might use the concept of safety to provide protections and privileges to certain segments of its population while alienating and endangering many others. What the government claims to be safety might lead to inequality and division among its citizens. Can we really trust a government to ensure the safety of all its citizens, or just the citizens the leaders in the government favor? The Nazi government under Hitler works well for a counterexample here, because we can call into question whether a government can be trusted to ensure the safety of all its citizens. Hitler and the Nazi Party certainly provide evidence that in some cases individual citizens have to look out for themselves rather than rely on the government. Other counterexamples that would work here are the US and segregation or South African apartheid, really any government system that allows or promotes inequality. I've mentioned having an example bank a few times, so let's quickly discuss how to go about preparing examples. And from the outset, I want to stress that there is no perfect way. This is what a pre-made example might look like, so go ahead and pause the video if you'd like to read through the notes. The key point here is you don't have to have too many details because you want to be able to recall the main ideas that will help support a claim in your essay. Does this example capture the true complexity of the Cuban Missile Crisis? It absolutely does not. It is a much more nuanced historical moment, and it definitely included Cuba and Cuban leadership, But when you are creating these examples, you should narrow them down. They are not intended to capture all the details of a historical event or all the achievements in someone's life. They are simply meant to make coming up with examples easier, and as such, just need enough information to help kickstart your memory. We're going to talk about one last thing in this lesson, and that is creating an outline. An outline can be helpful in terms of keeping your thoughts organized and giving you a map that you can refer back to if you're catching yourself moving off topic. Is the outline an absolutely essential step in this process? No. It is more of a time-dependent option, but if it helps you focus on one example per paragraph, it might be a good option for you. So here's what we have so far. We have our prompt and we have our pro-con list. We also actually have a list of examples we just created. And when we're outlining, we are going to use that to organize our brainstorming and examples. That's going to help us let brainstorming guide us as to which side we will argue for. It also helps us review our pros and cons and our examples. And in doing so, it's going to help prioritize the order of our points based on the quality of the supporting examples. The most important thing is that we lead with the best example. So your strongest example is the example that should be in your first body paragraph, and an outline can help us identify and prioritize that. And finally, an outline can also help us identify our one counterexample, which we have to remember to work into our essay plan.